Hello everybody and welcome to the Point of Care Foundation webinar, where today we're going to be discussing challenging Schwartz Rounds topics presented by Dr. Rory Conn. I'm Esther Flanagan, Schwartz Programme Manager at the Point of Care Foundation, and I'm going to be chairing today's session. So before we begin, I just want to go over a few reminders. This webinar is due to last 45 minutes, so we're aiming to finish by 3:45 p.m. It is being recorded, so it will be available on the Point of Care Foundation website afterwards. So if any of your colleagues aren't able to join today, please encourage them to watch it at a later point. You're all in listen mode only, so you can hear us, hopefully. Please tell us in the chat function that you can hear us, actually. But we won't be able to hear you. So if you want to chat to one another or ask any questions, please use the chat function box at the bottom of your screens. Before finishing the webinar today, we're going to put up a very short feedback form. It's just 8 multiple choice questions, so please fill it in before you exit your screens. So, our aims for today's session. First of all, we're going to hear from Rory. He's going to talk about his experience of the junior doctor strikes. And then the main discussion is going to focus on the round that he ran at GOSH, which was on to strike or not to strike. So we'll be talking mostly about that, thinking about the challenges that topics like that bring, and also the rewards that come with that. And we'd also really like to hear from you. So as we talk, please put comments in the chat box, share your experiences of challenging Schwartz Rounds topics that you've run, and any questions that you ask, we'll be collating them, and hopefully we'll have some time to ask Rory those questions towards the end of the session. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Rory Conn. Rory's a child and adolescent psychiatrist who's currently working in Haringey, and he was instrumental in setting up the Schwartz Rounds at GOSH, and he still goes back there each month to facilitate the rounds. So over to you, Rory.
Well, thank you very much for asking me, Esther, and the Point of Care Foundation. We are going to talk about our round particularly, but we wanted to set the context about the industrial action that's gone on in recent months. And we're sure that lots of you will know a lot about it already, but I wanted to speak particularly from the point of view of the psychological effects and processes that have gone on and how I've experienced them. I think it's been a really seminal time for a whole generation of young doctors, myself included, and my wife is also a junior doctor training in paediatrics. Lots of people have talked about the politicisation of doctors, and particularly the Department of Health has used that phrase, but I think it's been one of political awakening, and in some regards it's been very useful. An objective view about the process is that it's involved a fascinating set of systemic, political, ethical and interpersonal processes, and some of these were the reasons that we were really drawn to talking about it as a round. There are 54,000 approximately junior doctors in the country, and over a series of months and in fact years, feelings have been running very high, particularly around the time that Jeremy Hunt announced there would be imposition of a contract that was thought to be unsafe and unfair by junior doctors. 20,000 of us marched on Downing Street, and I'd like to point out we stayed behind to clear up the litter that we made from that march. But generally the feelings have been many and quite confused. Junior doctors have felt angry and upset. I think that's been obvious. Less obvious perhaps is how confusing it's been for us. Who is telling the truth, in inverted commas? Is there such a thing as truth in such disputes? And what really is right for our patients and for us as doctors? We felt conflicted, we felt frustrated, and certainly in the more recent months, my personal view is I've felt what a great waste of time and resources it has all been. So the frustration is something that bubbles over into work and has led to a lot of doctors, including my wife, considering leaving the professions, which would be a great shame. And actually, this has led me to reflect on what's really driving this process. We could talk about what the government really want for the NHS at length, but this is important to highlight that there's a huge group of clinicians within our National Health Service who have been feeling downtrodden, undervalued, misinformed for quite a long time. And the sort of toxic feelings from those things that have really emerged have been only accentuated by what we feel is spin from the government, the provocation that we've been under, and a growing mistrust in the Secretary of State. I don't want this to be a political rambling, but these are some of the thoughts I've been having in preparing for this. And there's also, in terms of our emotional responses, being a real paranoia, I think, about agendas that are in play. And this has led to a lot of doctors, yes, becoming much more political. I think that's actually a good thing. And I want to focus on some of the positives of this process. Jeremy Hunt's actions particularly have galvanised, energised and empowered a group of junior doctors, a large group. And whilst junior doctors spend our lives in training, generally speaking, keeping our heads down, looking to please a hierarchy that we perceive, and being mindful of receiving good references and so on, and actually jumping through successive bureaucratic hoops, this has been a time of real unity and change for junior doctors. Where previously we were quite docile and passive, certainly on a regional or national level, there's been real cross-specialty unity between grades, across sectors, and a lot of very interesting and meaningful political acts. I put this one up here. This is the chair that was manned outside the Department of Health to encourage Jeremy Hunt to come back to talks. And it was done thoughtfully and with real meaning. But there's been a great camaraderie in what's gone on. We've been really pleased to have had so much support from our senior clinicians and from our nurses and allied health professionals. So a real camaraderie has developed. And actually, you can see a good deal of humour and creativity in what's gone on. So these are a few signs I picked from the most recent protests. And people have kept their sense of humour, even under a time of great strain and hardship. So there's been a good deal of breaking down of silos. I know that I personally have found out a lot more about the working lives of other groups of junior doctors and nurses and allied health professionals. And one of our most outspoken leaders from the junior doctor group, Rachel Clark, has written a lot about what's gone on. And I just wanted to focus on a couple of points she's made. She said that the whole process has transformed junior doctors from pliant, subservient workhorses of the NHS into outspoken leaders willing to stand up for their principles, in particular fairness and safety. And one quote from her article in the Huffington Post, she says, "We found not only a common identity, but a common vision we never knew we shared." And I think actually that speaks a bit to Schwartz Rounds generally about bringing people together for the right reasons and sharing a dialogue. So I wanted to mention that. And the life of a junior doctor has felt, even personally, a bit like treated like cattle at times. I wanted to draw the analogy of us actually having had a herd mentality for many months, quite separate from the actions of the BMA. There's been interesting learning points about the media and how powerful that can be. We were branded as Moe medics, which was felt to be very unfair and very demoralising. But equally, when the media were supportive of us, that helped us get a song to #2 at Christmas and has really helped keep people's spirits up. I wanted finally, before we move on to talk about the rounds, to mention how things are at the minute, how they stand, because maybe people don't know where things are at. There has been a negotiated settlement through ACAS, following what was quite an inspired intervention from the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges. And unfortunately, since the terms and conditions of this new contract have been published, we've returned to our silos as junior doctors, and real schisms have developed in this unity. There's infighting on groups like Facebook, and fear and anger has returned. And I think that's desperately sad to see, but all the more reason for us to have productive conversations. In fact, it's been a bit with our referendum, the BMA's referendum around the corner next week at the same time as the EU referendum. There are quite a few parallels to be drawn in that. And as a group of doctors, we have been like a large political party, which is now seen to be breaking up, just as the Conservatives perhaps are in front of us. It's been a very moving process for me, actually, in a lot of ways. It's impacted on me greatly. I just wanted to share one sort of Schwartzy narrative that I had Now, I didn't take part in the full walkout for a number of reasons I won't go into. One of them was a financial one, and when I said to my consultant in Haringey that I couldn't afford, because of childcare, to lose 2 days of salary, she offered to cover that and pay me my salary for those 2 days. And it really touched me, and it spoke a lot to a sense of hope and support within the NHS. So I want to set the scene really for the round that we had, so hopefully people can imagine how it panned out. We had 4 people on our panel, as is normal at Great Ormond Street. We had 2 junior doctors, one of whom was the BMA rep for the Trust, another of whom was quite outspoken on social media and a friend of mine. We then had the medical director who spoke third, and finally a middle grade nurse from the gastroenterology team. Whilst that panel perhaps wasn't as representative as it might have been, as broad as it might have been, we did have good attendance from a range of professionals. This is quite a low number for us at Great Ormond Street, 58, but this is the first time we trialled a round in the morning. It was at 9:30, and unfortunately clashing with ward rounds, I think we've learned a lesson there. But we were pleased with the feedback that we got. 95, I think, % of our attendees said that they would have recommended it to a colleague and will attend again. And we won't go through all the comments, but just wanted to draw out the last one here, which did point out that it felt slightly different from other rounds, a bit more about explaining and rationalising positions rather than an emotive reflection. So that was very handy for us to see. Our 4th panellist, as I said, was a nurse who really was absolutely fantastic. She was sort of the foil for the 3 doctors talking, and I wanted to draw out the final sentence that she felt her most significant role in all of this was to support the doctors, and one way she could help in doing that was to be on the Schwartz panel.
Okay, so at this point I'm going to ask Rory some questions. I just want to remind people that if you have any reflections or thoughts as we're talking, please do use the chat function to sort of talk to one another as well. So my first question is about the topic itself. So at the point of care, and many people who are tuned in have attended our training, so they'll know that what we usually recommend is don't pick topics that are very raw or quite live. And obviously this is a topic that was very live and still is very live. So my first question is, why did you decide to run this topic? Whether it was you, your steering group, your organisation, what was the decision behind that?
Well, I think that as a steering group, we recognised this was obviously a contentious subject and one that was likely to be evocative. We mulled over it a lot, and there was a recognition, I think, that whilst many people in the audience attending would have clearly defined views on the matter, equally there might be a lot of people in the organisation feeling confused, ambivalent or disconnected about the industrial action. So that was one reason for doing it. I should point out, actually, when we decided to do it, it was a couple of months in advance of the actual round. We did it 1 week before the full walkout. And we did anticipate, actually, that the issue might be resolved by the time of the round. So it became more and more live and more heated during our preparation. And there was a point, I suppose, where we could have decided to not have run the round. But actually that felt, when we briefly considered it, that would have been counterproductive. And with a hot topic like this, we decided it would be best to address it head on. There were picket lines outside of the hospital. This is a very visible subject and needed to be talked about.
Okay, so it sounds like that in the lead up to the round, it might have felt as if it was becoming more unsafe, but then it felt maybe that it was too late to pull out at that point.
Yeah, I think on some level it did feel unsafe, but the time was also right for us as a Schwartz group to do something a bit different. So this was our 9th round at Great Ormond Street, and we were at a point, I think, certainly retrospectively, where we could do anger, where we could try and process that and dissipate some of it. Our previous rounds had been more generic, more clinical. We began with a patient I'll never forget, most places do. But they'd also been quite retrospective. So this was a chance to tackle something different that was evolving and in process. And actually, this was something different because we were considering how issues outside of the organisation could impact on what's occurring within. And that was quite useful because, you know, our lives are affected by wider political contexts. And so I'm quite pleased that we went ahead in that regard.
Thank you. Okay, so now thinking more about your preparation and moving towards the round itself. When I first heard about the fact that you were going to do a topic, to strike or not to strike, my first thought was this is going to evoke a lot of problem solving, and I was wondering how you would manage that. So in the preparation, the panel preparation, first of all, was it harder to find people who were willing to speak about this topic? And then when you actually prepared them, was it more difficult to shape the stories in a way that focused on emotion and not the rights and wrongs of the contract?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'd say on that is focusing on the language that we used in the title. So it was a good decision, I think, to use a title, and I'll just read it out again: to strike or not to strike, a modern NHS dilemma. We didn't want to make any specific references to the junior doctor contract because we wanted to make sure this was a conversation not restricted to one group, and one that would invite people from multiple different professions to consider being on our panel. It was surprisingly easy, I think, to identify people who would speak on this panel. We thought it was important not to have 4 doctors. We had a good balance in terms of having 2 male and 2 female panelists. I think it was easier finding panelists than usual because this was one subject where people were really keen to talk to it. Perhaps on reflection, the 2 junior doctors we had were not the most representative of junior doctors overall because they were pretty politicised and they knew the subject matter inside out. But I don't think that was a bad thing in retrospect. Your second question was about whether we had to think about the problem-solving issue. I think we definitely did. We were very keen that it didn't end up being a debate, a black and white, should we or should we not strike. Going back to the title again, there are some places we publicised it with a question mark in it, to strike or not to strike, and other places where the question mark didn't appear. And I think that was just sloppiness on our part, really. But some people did comment, oh, I thought that was going to be a debate if they were coming for the first time. And I'm pleased that it didn't go into that, really.
So because the title is almost a question, I suppose, so you could say that you were encouraging problem solving in the topic by itself.
Yeah, so I think that's a healthy challenge. And actually, one thing that we wanted to avoid as well, we really wanted to base it in the present, so that's why the word modern NHS dilemma is in there. What we anticipated would happen was that people would talk about previous strikes, and that did happen in the context. That was a bit hard to get away from, I think, because our medical director did very well. He was a really good panellist, and he started his narrative talking about his father resigning his BMA membership from years gone by. It was useful to have that historical context, but then other people did find themselves shifting back to previous contexts, and we did have to keep them kind of grounded of what we were trying to achieve. The other thing I was going to say in terms of finding the panellists, we did seek out and want a junior doctor who was going to speak very much against striking. And when I spoke to one of my facilitator colleagues this morning to find what she remembered of that, she spoke about the glimmers of hope we had of having someone speak against the strikes. And ultimately, nobody really wants to do that, which is interesting in itself. But then that prevented it being a back and forth tennis match, I think. In terms of how hard it was to prepare them, I was just going to say as well that there was a lot of anxiety, I think, in the steering group, in myself, about what this round would look like. But interestingly, less uncertainty than normal, I think, from the panellists about what they should talk about and how they should deliver it, because they really had, certainly the 2 junior doctors, quite a clear mandate, I suppose, in their mind of what they wanted to deliver on behalf of junior doctors. We didn't have anyone pull out, which was a relief. And actually, it was the same amount of preparation I think we would do for any other panel. at Grosvenor Street, we tend to prepare them on their own, just from a logistic point of view, and then bring them together, particularly on the day, so they know what each other is saying. The only thing we had to do slightly was, well, even just before the round started, I found myself encouraging the medical director to dilute some of the passion in it, and I think that was good.
So it's interesting what you say about the panelists being quite ready and willing to talk about this topic, and I wondered whether the fact that it was quite a live topic meant that their emotions were kind of closer to the surface, and sometimes with other topics where people are sharing stories that go back 20 odd years, you have to actually dig a bit deeper.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think it was immediately there. There were stories breaking in the news that morning, I remember, about the latest thing that the BMA had said, or the latest thing Jeremy Hunt had said. So it was pretty inescapable, and I doubt anyone coming to the rounds had no view or no idea of what we might be covering on the day.
Okay, so let's move on to the round itself. I was actually in attendance at the round, and one observation that I had was that I felt you had to work quite hard to bring it back to the emotional aspects relating to the strike. So I think people did get drawn in slightly to the details of the contract, although there were themes that definitely emerged around people feeling very confused, and this sense of unity and people coming together because of the strikes. So could you just tell us how it felt during the round itself?
Yeah, well, I'll talk firstly about the personal emotional response of doing it. I mean, I felt really proud to be facilitating this round, actually. I hadn't participated in the most recent industrial action, and this I felt was kind of my way of demonstrating the need to address the issues in hand without being on a picket line. In some regards, I was more nervous than previous rounds I've facilitated, and in others less so. I think that because I knew the subject matter very well, that made me feel a bit more secure about it. But at the same time, I felt that it was really unpredictable where the audience might take this. I was worried that people would want to problem solve. I was worried that the subjects would drift, or maybe perhaps even dramatically shift, just as it had done with the junior doctors on our Facebook group, into a conflation of saving the NHS or an anti-austerity discussion or similar. At times it did do that, and I think the clinical lead and myself had to be quite disciplined in bringing it back. The other worry I had during the round, which did surface perhaps, was there would be a reference to the intergenerational divides. Well, in my day we wouldn't have done this, and people being overly retrospective. And that was a particular challenge for this one. In terms of the facilitator role, the more I've reflected on this in preparing for our webinar, the more I've realised that I had very strong views about this subject. And I do think I had unconscious wishes about how the round should develop. I hope that any negative views people had about industrial action would be transformed or diluted by attending. And so there's a question really as to whether I was too close to the issue or too consumed.
Do you feel that you were able to stay neutral as a facilitator?
I hope so, but I do. Well, no one fed back saying why was there a junior doctor facilitating things. But I think there may have been a conflict of interest there.
I think that's something to ask the audience, and I don't know whether anyone has any reflections on that. Whether there have been round topics where you felt it was difficult to stay neutral because the topic resonated with you quite strongly. Did you have anything else on that, or should we?
Yeah, well, I was going to say that it was. I mean, I think it was just a really consuming thing to be going on. A personal reflection is that each night, when we're going to bed, my wife was saying, "It's time to go to bed. Why are you still checking the Facebook group?" And it became something of a compulsion for lots of junior doctors to be immersing themselves in the details and the discussion of this. And I found it quite helpful to have a space to come and just talk about it, knowing it was only going to be an hour. And it felt a relief to me, and I hope that it felt like that to other junior doctors in the room who could sort of unburden what was in their mind.
Okay. So I was sitting in the round, and during the discussion, I was thinking, I wonder whether non-clinical staff can engage with this, because it was very much focused on doctors and clinicians. But then I was pleasantly surprised when at least 2 people in the audience reflected on their experiences. But I wondered whether you thought that non-clinical staff at that round did feel included in the discussion.
Well, I hope so. I think it's always difficult to sort of know how it's going when you're in the thick of it. But one of the comments from the floor I really remember stood out to me was one of our administrators at Great Ormond Street. And she gave a very clear, matter-of-fact, but emotional view of how it had felt as her, in her role and her department's role, having to cancel the appointments of these poor patients who were put back because of the strikes. And so she spoke to the sort of unseen distress, I think, within the organisation about it. In retrospect, she would have been an excellent panellist to have had. But she was a non-clinical staff member who gave feedback at the end to say, you know, I was pleased I was here, I was pleased I got to speak to how this had felt for me. And there were some others in the room who commented as well, I think.
We have a quick question here from Anne, so hopefully we can just clarify it, who asked who was the co-facilitator, what profession?
So yeah, I don't know if we had the balance there right either. So my co-facilitator was also a doctor, also male, also a psychiatrist. Again, nobody commented on that, but that would have been open to questioning, I suppose, the validity of that. And we might have had a more balanced view to the facilitation if that had been different.
Is there anything you would have done differently, do you think, looking back?
Aside from the timing in the morning, which we thought we probably won't do another breakfast type round again, yes, probably having one of the administrators on the panel. I think generally with the Schwartz Rounds I've done, the sort of surprise panellist who speaks to something unseen or unthought about is often the best panellist and the one that people take most away from. I'd wonder about my neutrality, I suppose. But we stuck to the model, and I think we delivered it quite well. But the other thing I was going to say about the non-clinical staff being heard is that last week I spoke to one of the mentors who covers Royal Devon and Exeter, and they ran the same round about the strikes. And I was really pleased to hear that someone else had tackled it as well. They did it a bit later than us, but they had an administrator on that team. They talked about the round. I think the title was "Backed into a Corner," and their administrator spoke apparently on the day about how she felt like a mother to the junior doctors because her role was to coordinate a rota. And just like with us, apparently the feedback was, that was such a wonderful thing to hear about interprofessional working and emotions. So I wanted to bring that up.
Thank you. Okay, so this is a slightly broader question. Thinking about contentious topics, having run one or maybe more, what would you recommend to other Schwartz Rounds facilitators and clinical leads if they're thinking about doing topics such as these?
Well, it goes without saying that you need to approach the more complex and more emotive ones with caution, lots of thought and planning. And whilst ours went well, we could have easily justified doing much more planning on it than we did. I think generally speaking, it's a good rule of thumb to do a controversial round once you're well established with Schwartz Rounds. So perhaps at least 4 or 5 of them under your belt as a group or as a facilitator. And that's because, firstly, the facilitators will feel more comfortable about what's going on, but also because attendees need to understand and be comfortable, really, with the format and the culture, the sort of non-judgmental listening and reflection that is Schwartz, in order to do something a bit riskier. The other things that I've thought about on this question are making sure you've got enough stakeholder engagement before you tackle around like this. So Who do you need to inform what's going on? Whose views should you receive about doing this round? And perhaps even within the steering group, asking how is this round going to be perceived within the organisation? Are attendees going to be more likely to wonder about what agenda is being produced here? And are there an appropriate range of panel members so that people don't leave thinking, well, that was a biased representation or a one-sided view on this difficult topic? I think going back to what I said earlier about titles, the title is really hugely important with all Schwartz rounds, but particularly if you're doing something controversial, something contentious, because people get put off easily, or they may retrospectively say, I had the wrong idea, that's not quite what I thought this was going to be about. So I think spending enough time focusing on a title is good. And then, well, sort of how do you decide whether something is too soon or too hot a topic? That's worth talking about. I think if there's an ongoing unresolved clinical issue that's being considered, then I would say avoid it. I think you'd say avoid as well, wouldn't you? If there's a clinical thing, because that could be risky on different levels. And then also, if a subject is restricted to only an internal issue or problem, then I certainly would advise treading very, very carefully. The nice thing about talking about the industrial action was we could always refer to something outside of the organisation, outside of the room. There was an other on which people could rest their anger. And I think if you've got a highly emotive subject within your organisation, that could be more likely to get out of control or feel more uncomfortable for people. Finally, the other thing I've written, and I've touched on already, is whether the facilitator needs to be mindful of how close they are to the issue. I think, for example, if you were doing a hot topic in the organisation and the facilitator was directly related to that issue, then another facilitator should be picked.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions coming up in the chat box, and the first one is about censoring. So what's your thoughts on when panelists have sort of prepared what they're going to say in the preparation, but then on the day might censor what they say or hold back somewhat? Have you had that experience?
No, I've heard about the opposite of panelists saying things sort of on the spur of the moment that weren't really in their agenda of what they were going to say. And we talked about that last week in the mentors meeting, didn't we? And I thought it's kind of all right if someone says something off subject or that takes you by surprise as a facilitator to name that and say, that's interesting, some of the things that came up there weren't quite what we thought you were going to talk about, but that's okay. And equally, if you're hoping that a panelist is going to cover something and then they don't, well, that might be something that you bring as a thought of your own and simply say, I know that some of the panelists have been thinking about this as well. And you can bring it into the room in that manner, I think.
Thank you. Another question we had was about buy-in from senior management. So do you think it's important to get that buy-in if a topic's particularly controversial?
Yes, we talked about this earlier, didn't we? We sort of weighing up the difficult decision about, do you consider running a subject by senior management in advance? And we thought probably not, because you don't really need approval from senior management to do anything. I mean, if it's likely to be a risky one, make sure they're there in the room so they don't have some skewed view about what was discussed. But you might tell them you're doing it. I think rather than seeking permission, you seek forgiveness. So do the round, having informed them that you're going to do the round, and they'll probably then attend it. And that might avoid later conflict about them saying, we had no idea that you were planning this. Yeah.
And I suppose it's the same skills that you'd be using in trying to ensure that the organisational safety is managed regardless of what the topic is.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's more important than ever with these kind of subjects to set the rules and boundaries, going through the narrative at the start of the round, and you might do exactly the same narrative to the senior manager who's questioning what you're up to. Another thing that came up at the mentor day was this question of, if there's a lot of distress in the room around a contentious topic, should you be offering up someone to talk to? Should a facilitator say, you know, I'm here at the end if anyone wants to mull this over with me? And actually the general view from the mentors across the country was that's not a good idea, and you need to stick with the boundaries and enforce them because they're there for a reason, really. You rely on the organisation itself to support its members in different ways. That's not the role of the rounds.
And asking whether anyone spoke out against the strike at the round.
Well, the medical director who was third on our panel, people knew in the room that on the days of previous industrial action, he'd gone to the picket line and he'd said to the junior doctors, are you sure this is what you should be doing? And something along the lines of, I wouldn't be doing this if I was still a junior doctor. That was a bit diluted on the day, and from a personal perspective, I think it's really good that he didn't say, this is my view, because he was in a senior leadership position, and that would have seemed perhaps to be the view of the hospital, you know, the view of the chief exec and so on, and that would have put the junior doctors in a difficult position, I think. No one really spoke out against the strike in the audience. There may well have been feelings about that, but the tone, the way it ran, it just, you know, ended up being more towards this is something good to talk about, and generally people understand why the junior doctors were doing it.
Okay, I think we're going to draw to a close soon. So if anyone has any last burning questions, please type them now into the chat box. Rory, do you have any sort of final comments or reflections before we finish off?
Well, I've got a bullet point in front of me that says comfortably digested, ? And I think that was my thought around doing a risky round. And does it need to be something that's had enough time, enough water under the bridge for people to think this is a historic event that we've got a hold of now, but let's reflect on it generally? And I think actually not. I mean, I think if you feel confident as a steering group and as a facilitator, it can be helpful for organisations to be agitated in their thinking. That can be a good thing. Of course, it's more likely if you get it wrong for it to be distressing. But if we don't take risks, then we won't achieve anything. I think it's good in these rounds to name the unnameable. Probably our other most risky round we had in the last 12 months was talking about the 7/7 bombings, which happened at Russell Square around the corner from Great Ormond Street, and many of the victims and the injured were brought to Great Ormond Street. We ran that round on the 10-year anniversary of the bombings, and that was because it hadn't really been talked about in the organisation. I wasn't around at the time, of course, I was a mere babe, but you know, afterwards people did say that's great, because why have we never actually thought about how distressing that was for us? And again, it was a brave thing to do. There was a huge amount of emotion in the room, but it was the right thing to do as well. So I'm pleased we took the bull by the horns, albeit 10 years on down the line.
Thank you. I think there's one question that's come up. So we'll just do that last question and then we'll finish off. So Anne-Marie has said, we found after doing 2 rounds, lots of emotion under the surface from the audience. Topics have been a day I'll never forget or a person I'll never forget that inspires me. Lots of feedback and requests from staff each time that they want support available afterwards. Okay, so this is what you've sort of touched on already, and how to manage that. I mean, generally at the Point of Care Foundation, we recommend that you don't rush in and signpost and offer psychological support, because that's sending out the wrong message, which is that being distressed is wrong or not acceptable, when actually a lot of us feel distressed a lot of the time anyway. And I think the power of the rounds, one of the main things that the rounds help people to do is to normalise that emotion, and to recognise that it is normal to feel that way. But I think it's hard for the facilitators to kind of contain the anxiety of, are we kind of inducing that distress in people, and having to sort of hold that without finding a resolution. Do you have anything to add?
Well, I think that must be really quite common after doing 2 rounds, and people are finding what they're comfortable in expressing, and it may be that as the rounds develop, people feel more able to turn to each other, either immediately after a round or a couple of days later on reflection. You might even consider, I suppose, after a couple of rounds, doing something on that, a title of "How do we support one another," for example, because that, the exact subject could be addressed in a useful way in a round.
You could also try to do pop-up rounds or smaller scale versions of rounds in maybe certain departments or areas of the organisation where people might be feeling that lack of support more than others. And there's information about that on our website if you want to read about it. I'm just aware of time, and I think we're going to have to wrap up. So I want to say thank you to Rory and everyone who's joined us today for taking time out of your busy days. And we hope you enjoyed the webinar. It is going to be CPD accredited, so you can claim 1 point, I think, for attending. And as I said earlier, please encourage your colleagues to watch it if they haven't managed to tune in today. Bex has put up this very short survey. I promise you it will take less than 60 seconds to fill in. So please do take 1 minute now to answer those questions, as it does shape what we do with our webinars in the future. And thank you once again to Rory.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.